Hi, I'm Ivan Galanin. Welcome to Educator. Today we're going to be evaluating dimethylaminoethanol, DMAE. Wait, I've never heard of DMAE. Why are you evaluating DMAE? No one uses it, right? Well, one YouTuber called DMAE the next retinol, and you're going to see it's an amazing case story for everything that's wrong with skincare today. And we're going to use the educator framework. We're going to show you guys why it was worth spending 53 minutes listening about the evaluation framework, because the framework is going to show its stuff today. We're going to talk about the what, element one, what does it do? And we're going to see how difficult that is to nail down with cosmetics, how very difficult that is. And then we have element two, the how, the mechanism of action, the motive. And with DMAE, it's all about the motive or the lack of motive in many cases. Element number three, the evidence. And with DMAE, we've got in vitro evidence a little bit. We've got in vivo evidence. Yes, we've got animal studies and we've got clinicals, a few clinicals, not just one, a few. So we've got a lot of evidence with DMAE to pour through. And perhaps the most interesting aspect of the DMAE story, the sourcing, the witnesses, the evidence. We're going to show you how sourcing matters. It's a case study for the vitality, the importance of sources, and to understand where you're being maybe a little bit misled by the witnesses. So I'm going to tell you how I came upon DMAE because it's important. 10 days ago, I didn't know the first thing about DMAE, never heard of it. And an ADIPO community member reached out to me and asked me about it. And I said, oh, let me take a look. And when I looked, I thought, oh my God, the universe is giving me a gift. It's a case study. It explains the importance of the framework. And the best part is because I didn't know about DMAE 10 days ago, I came at it with absolutely no bias. I don't know any of the brands that use it. I don't care about any of the brands that use it. They're not competitors. It's just completely clean. I can actually just go at it in a completely clean, unbiased way. Just go where it takes me. So, you ready to learn? Are you excited? Have I gotten you excited about something 2 minutes ago you'd never heard of? Well, awesome. Let's go. So, with DMAE, element one, we are going to introduce through the lens of three different YouTubers. I know, we're bringing a little entertainment into educator, a little entertainment to go along with the education. So these three YouTubers are each going to tell you what they think the product does. We're going to start out with the OG of Dr. Brands, the OG, Dr. Nicholas Perricone himself, white coat, slick back hair, and he's going to tell you how he discovered DMAE in the early 2000s. So come on, Dr. Nicholas Perricone, show us what you got.
Hello, I'm Dr. Nicholas Perricone, and it's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I was seeing a patient, and I applied some lotion with DMAE to the patient's face, and I got called away to the phone, as most doctors are if you sit in an office. And when I got back to this patient, 20 minutes had gone by, and I'm looking, and the patient's face is now asymmetric. It's actually lopsided. And I know I just applied a lotion with DMAE. I'm looking at the effect on muscle tone. The eye is wider on one side. The cheek is lifted. There's more contour in the mandibular region. Everything is lifted. This face looks like it's come in. And it's from a lotion that I applied 20 minutes ago. The muscles are controlled by nerves. And I knew from my neurochemistry that DMAE is a building block of acetylcholine. So my supposition was, what if we're just applying nutrients to the skin that are needed to get to the neuromuscular junction to elevate levels of that acetylcholine to give us tone like we did when we were young. And here's the example. I'm looking at this patient with an asymmetric face. But it took a number of years to do the studies and delineate the mechanism of action, come up with DMAE. But now we have this topical, and it's absolutely a miracle to work with because it does give you a lift in 20 minutes. But the effects are cumulative. They get better with time. And so studies done by me and independent laboratories that you have instant tone, but then you have continued tone, and what that does is it shortens the muscle. And remember I told you about the fact that what makes us look young, not so much our lines and wrinkles, but the contours of the face and the amount of sagging that we have. So DMAE can actually thicken muscle, make it stronger looking.
So Dr. Perricone, he came out at full bore, told us the whole story, how he discovered it, neurotransmitters, white coat, slick back hair, clinicals, muscle improvement. Yeah, muscle improvement. All right. Now, the number 2 YouTuber is someone called Mad About Skin. Mad About Skin, he's the guy who told us that DMAE is the next retinol. So let's hear Mad About Skin.
If I told you that an ingredient existed which would firm the skin, reduce fine lines and wrinkles, increase hydration, and even fade hyperpigmentation, you'd probably call me a liar. It's too good to be true. Well, it's not. Actually, that ingredient does exist. It goes by the name DMAE, which is an abbreviated name for a majorly long scientific title, which I'll leave on the screen here. What these studies have shown is it actually has a meaningful impact in neurotransmitters in the skin, which can, as a result, minimize fine lines and wrinkles. Also has the side benefits of increasing hydration for a more plumping complexion, and it's also proven to minimize inflammation in the skin. Now, as inflammation is the #1 trigger to hyperpigmentation, it follows that if you're reducing inflammation, you're reducing excess pigment production. So first and foremost, it thickens the collagen that's present in the skin. This just means that collagen is a little bit more effective. It gives a more plump appearance to the skin, and it will also help with the hydration levels in the long term because collagen is the core building block of our skin. This, of course, will lead to fewer fine lines and wrinkles, but that effect is definitely cumulative. You didn't see it on day 1. There started to be a noticeable difference after the 4th week of application twice a day. So you're really going to want to be in this for the long haul.
So that was Mad About Skin, right? Pretty enthusiastic. Can't believe how great this is, right? Amazing. And I hope you don't feel that I'm making fun of Mad About Skin, because Mad About Skin, channels like that, they have their role. They're enthusiasts. They try products. They get excited about them. I'm not putting them down. I'm just showing their role in spreading what I believe is misinformation. And as we'll see, some of this misinformation could be dangerous. All right, now the next YouTuber, it's No BS Beauty. No BS Beauty, again, an enthusiast. In this case, we'll see a much more measured take and a much more thoughtful take on DMAE. All right, let's go. No BS Beauty.
Hey guys, so today I thought I'd talk about the ingredient DMAE in skincare products. I've been asked about it a lot, and it's a very complicated ingredient and topic to talk about because we get research from 2 different things that kind of conflict with each other. So, to be honest, do your own research on it, read the research, and come to your own conclusion. I mean, just because I might think something's worth a try doesn't necessarily mean for you it might work better. So it's always important. Just do your own research, make up your own mind. Studies on DMAE, which I would consider negative, basically state that the researchers found adding DMAE to the cultures of fibroblasts produce the effect known as vacuolization. It's often observed in cells after various types of damage, as cells try to encapsulate and excrete foreign agents from their own damaged components. Hence, research concluded that the vacuolization induced by DMAE was suggestive of cell damage.
Right? You can see her body language, right? She was conflicted. She was reading stuff that maybe she didn't understand completely, but she understood that it wasn't good. right? Vacuolization. I mean, you can't even pronounce that. Vacuolization, vacuole formation. All right, that's powerful stuff. So now we have 3 takes from 3 different YouTubers. Well, we've got Dr. Perricone, the OG, we've got Mad About Skin, and we've got No BS Beauty. And they've laid out the charges. So according to Dr. Perricone, it's all about improving muscle tone. It's a neurotransmitter. Damn it, neurotransmitter. Shortens the muscles. Yeah, muscle tone. We're going to be following that line of argument. Muscle tone improvement. All right? So Mad About Skin. We've got a few charges that he wants us to pursue. 1, improvement in fine lines. 2, improvement in coarse lines. 3, improvement in pigmentation, skin tone. And 4, improvement in hydration. All right? So those are the charges according to Mad About Skin. Now, No BS Beauty, she's put forth a simpler case. Damage. DMAE works through irritation, through damaging the skin. That's what she read. All right? So, No BS Beauty, she's got a very straightforward case for us to pursue, a very straightforward set of charges. Could DMAE be primarily causing irritation? All right? So those are the 3 sets of charges. So now let's look at element number 2, the motives or mechanisms of action. How could something like DMAE be responsible for the charges, for the claims put behind it? Well, we'll start with Dr. Perricone's charges. We've already shown his card. He's suggesting that DMAE is acting as a neurotransmitter to change muscle function and structure. Wow, a topical that changes muscle structure and function. Wow, that's a huge charge, because for that to happen, DMAE would have to penetrate below the skin, like Botox, and affect the neuromuscular junction. That is a heady charge. But he's a doctor. He's got a white coat. Let's take a look at it. All right, Mad About Skin. He suggests 2 ideas for how DMAE could be working. One idea, he says that it could be improving pigmentation by turning down inflammation. He tells us that inflammation is a major cause of hyperpigmentation in the skin, and there's some truth to that. So we're going to be looking at the anti-inflammatory effects, potential anti-inflammatory effects of DMAE. And then he also brings out the old trope with skincare products, collagen. Well, it builds collagen, he tells us. It builds collagen. So that's actually a very challenging charge, because for DMAE to build collagen in a functional way, in an effective way, it would have to penetrate deeply into the skin and reach the skin's fibroblasts and get them to produce more collagen than they're already producing. So that's a pretty heady charge too. Now, No BS. She's given us a pretty clear mechanism of action. She's told us that DMAE is toxic. And from the snippet that she read, DMAE causes vacuoles to form in fibroblasts. Vacuoles, empty spaces filled with water that cells use to segregate toxins. And so she's given us a very straightforward mechanism of action, vacuole formation. So, pretty interesting. We had three different sets of charges, three and change with the multiple charges from Mad About Skin. And we have 3+ mechanisms of action or motives to explain those charges. So this is pretty interesting, right? 3 different cases. You can imagine them playing out in 3 different courtrooms. Got Dr. Perricone in one courtroom being all serious and doctorly. You've got Mad About Skin in another courtroom being all enthusiastic and next best thing since retinol. And in a third courtroom, you've got No BS Beauty, who's just looking at the facts and saying, wow, vacuoles, really? Let's think about vacuoles. All right. Now we're ready to get into the evidence. So now we're going to look at the evidence to support the charges and mechanisms of action put forth by our YouTube friends. And we're going to start with the in vitro data. And we'll start with the argument put forth by Dr. Perricone. The DMAE is acting as a neurotransmitter, stimulating the facial muscles and strengthening muscle tone or increasing muscle size or shortening the muscles, having some beneficial effect on the musculature of the face. So we're looking at this paper, The Role of Dimethylaminoaethanol in Cosmetic Dermatology. And it's written by Rachel Grossman, who's working for Johnson & Johnson Consumer Products. And Rachel Grossman is arguing for a case for DMAE in cosmetic dermatology. And so she's searching for a motive. And she has this chapter, Pharmacological Actions of DMAE. And so the first idea is that DMAE may be acting indirectly as a neurotransmitter. So not that DMAE is a neurotransmitter and that gets muscles to contract, but the DMAE is increasing the levels of other neurotransmitters. And the most prominent neurotransmitter is acetylcholine. So the idea is, can DMAE increase the levels of acetylcholine in the skin? And she says quite clearly, the cutaneous influx of choline or an increase in the levels of acetylcholine in skin following topical application of DMAE have not yet been documented. So there is no evidence that applying DMAE to the skin causes choline, which is a precursor of acetylcholine, or acetylcholine to be increased in the skin. No evidence. Now we're going to look at the same source, the Grossman paper, for in vitro evidence to support that DMAE is acting as an anti-inflammatory agent or in some way to stimulate fibroblasts to produce more collagen. Now we turn to the idea that DMAE may be an anti-inflammatory. She has a section, Anti-Inflammatory Activity of DMAE. And she refers to a study where they take peripheral blood lymphocytes, these are T cells, in a dish, and they stimulate them to secrete inflammatory cytokines. And the cytokines they make range from IL-1 alpha, IL-2, IL-4, IL-6, IL-10, and everyone's favorite TNF alpha. And you see that DMAE can inhibit the secretion at concentrations of 19 micrograms per milliliter for IL-2. At a much higher level, you need much more DMAE, 450 micrograms per milliliter to inhibit IL-6, And IL-10 is actually an anti-inflammatory cytokine. So this is actually inhibited at 425 microgram per milliliter. So it's unclear what inhibiting IL-10 is going to do, because IL-10 actually helps inflammation resolve. And what's worse is you're stimulating TNF alpha. Not only are you not inhibiting it, you're stimulating it. And to her credit, Dr. Grossman concludes the cutaneous anti-inflammatory activity of DMAE remains to be documented. So we have some uncertain anti-pro-inflammatory activities of DMAE in a model that is not entirely relevant to normal skin, and the conclusion that we don't really know about the skin anti-inflammatory activity. So now we're going to introduce the in vitro data to support the case and mechanism of action put forth by No BS Beauty. And we're going to go to a different source for that data. So now we want to discuss the evidence supporting No Beauty BS's case that DMAE is acting through irritation. And we turn to this paper for the in vitro data, and this paper is called The Anti-Wrinkle Effect of Topical Concentrated 2-dimethylaminoethanol Involves a Vacuolar Cytopathology. And so this is very straightforward. So these guys took fibroblasts, the cells that make collagen and elastin, and they have pictures of these cells for you to see. And this is 0 DMAE, and this is 2.5 millimolar, and 5 millimolar, and 10 millimolar. So these are relatively large concentrations, but as we see, these are the concentrations that the authors consider to be relevant to the topical use of 3% DMAE lotions or gels. At 2.5 millimole DMAE, you start to see these holes, or you start to see these vacuoles, these water-filled structures in the fibroblasts. So at 2.5 millimolar, you start to see these rounded vacuoles in the fibroblasts. And you see at 5 millimolar and at 10 millimolar, you see a dose effect. So as you're going up, you're seeing more of these vacuoles. Now, this group actually did something interesting, and they also looked at, okay, what's happening to these dermal fibroblasts if you culture them with DMAE for 4 hours and for 24 hours. And you see that for 4 hours, nothing much happens to the mortality of these cells. But if you culture them for 24 hours, if you expose them for 24 hours, starting at 10 millimolar, you have pretty significant mortality of these cells. And similarly, levels of DMAE beyond 1 millimolar is starting to have an effect on the ability of these cells to proliferate. Now, this group didn't just look at the fibroblasts, they also reasoned that DMAE was acting on epidermal cells, that perhaps it wasn't getting to the fibroblasts. So they wanted to see, do you have the same effect on epithelial cells in the epidermis? And they found that really at the same concentration, 2.5 millimole human skin epithelial cells, DMAE induced intracellular vacuoles of various sizes, many of which were very small and difficult to photograph. So you had the same effect in both the epithelial cells of the epidermis and the fibroblasts in the dermis. So very clear-cut support for a toxic effect of DMAE on cells in vitro. Okay, so let's review the in vitro data. So very clearly, there is no in vitro data to support Dr. Perricone's assertion that DMAE is acting as a neurotransmitter to activate the muscles in the face. No data. Now, for Mad About Skin, we have a little bit of data suggesting that DMAE may be acting in an anti-inflammatory capacity, but that data is mixed, with DMAE also stimulating inflammation in the same system. And the relevance of that system to the skin is not particularly relevant. So not a strong argument for its anti-inflammatory mechanism of action, and no data on its effect to stimulate fibroblasts to make collagen. And so, in fact, the second paper we saw, conversely, the DMAE could potentially inhibit the ability of fibroblasts to proliferate and was also toxic to fibroblasts. Now, the no BS beauty, we have pretty clear data in two different cell types, in fibroblasts and epithelial cells of the epidermis. The DMAE is inducing this vacuole forming effect in both cell types at same concentrations. So we've got some strong data for no BS beauty. We have a little bit of data for Mad About Skin, and no data supporting Dr. Perricone. All right, so now we turn our attention to in vivo data, and we're in luck because we have two examples of in vivo data. Unfortunately, for Dr. Perricone, there is no in vivo data supporting the idea that DMAE acts as a neurotransmitter enhancer in the skin, but there is a paper supporting Mad About Skin's assertion that DMAE may be increasing collagen content in the skin. Let's take a look at that paper now. So this paper is in vivo skin effects of a dimethylaminoaethanol based formulation. It's from a group in Brazil, and they did both clinical and in vivo work. And the in vivo work involved a hairless mouse model. And what they found was that both the vehicle and DMAE could increase the thickness of the epidermis. Not great support for a DMAE acting as a collagen inducer in fibroblasts. But they make a statement that when the dermis was evaluated, its thickness was only increased by formulations containing DMAE. Now, they don't show the actual amount of the increase. We know that it's highly statistically significant, 0.001, and they add this point that histopathological evaluation showed that collagen fiber thicknesses were improved by DMAE. So that's something, right? They don't give us the methodology, they don't show us the data, but they do suggest that DMAE increased collagen fiber thickness in the dermis of hairless mice. But they add a caution. Moreover, hairless mouse skin being thinner than human skin allows a larger permeation of active substances. Thus, considering the differences between hairless mouse and human skins, caution is needed in interpreting the results. So it's nice to see the authors balance the data and provide some perspective on whether the model they're using is representative of human skin. So to summarize this data, both the placebo formulation and the DMAE formulation enhance thickness of the epidermis. The DMAE enhanced the thickness of the dermis by an amount that we don't know, but they did see increased formation of collagen fibers. So some evidence supporting Mad About Skin's assertion. So now we're going to go back to the paper we've already seen and discuss the in vivo data supporting the hypothesis that DMAE is acting as an irritant. And this is the hypothesis that we're attributing to no BS beauty. Okay, so now we're going back to the paper by the Canadian group that looked at the in vitro toxicity of DMAE. So this is from the Canadian group that did the in vitro study with DMAE, and now they treated rabbit skin, and they looked at 3% DMAE, which is the same concentration of DMAE used in the cosmetic formulation. They treated the rabbit skin for 1 hour, and they found that the thickness of the skin increased significantly of the epidermis, and the proportions of cells with coilocytosis, which is representative of the type of vacuole seen in the in vitro data. They measured the proportion of cells with coilocytosis, and they showed that that proportion goes from 5% to over 15%. So they see very similar effect in the rabbit ear skin. Fortunately, only 2 rabbits were used, and they can show consistency between the in vitro cytotoxicity and the in vivo effects on the skin of the rabbit. Okay, so let's summarize the in vivo data. So unfortunately, no data to support Dr. Pericone's assertion. We have a tiny little bit of data to suggest that in a hairless mouse model that may not be representative of human skin, you have a thickening of the dermis, and that's associated with some type of increase in collagen fiber thickness. But we don't really know how much, and we don't really know whether it's natural, well-shaped collagen or abnormally shaped. But it's a little bit of data suggesting that DMAE can increase collagen formation in the skin. Now, the strongest data was in support of no BS beauty, where the irritation caused on rabbit skin was similar to the irritation caused by DMAE on fibroblasts and epithelial cells. You had a thickening of the skin of the epidermis in the rabbit, and you had a very similar formation of vacuoles in the skin of the rabbit. So very clear-cut evidence for no BS beauty, limited evidence in support of Mad About Skin, and no data to support Dr. Perricone. So now we're going to discuss the clinical data, and we're going to do this a little differently. There are 3 clinical studies, and we're going to discuss each one of them as a whole, and then we're going to draw conclusions on whether they support Dr. Perricone, Mad About Skin, or no BS. All right, so the 3 studies, one from an independent Brazil group, we've already seen their in vivo data, one from a Belgian group that was hired by Johnson & Johnson, but who is a very reputable human pharmacology group from Belgium. So that's the Belgian group. And 1.5 studies from Johnson & Johnson that we'll call the Johnson & Johnson studies. And those we'll start with because those are the studies that Mad About Skin and No BS Beauty refer to when they refer to the clinicals. All right, so now we'll start with the Johnson & Johnson studies. So this is the paper that we've already seen that discusses the Johnson & Johnson studies. So the Johnson & Johnson studies were never actually published in peer review format, but here we have Rachel Grossman discussing them. And so we have 2 results from these studies. One is an overall evaluation, clinician-rated overall appearance of aging skin, and comparing vehicle, placebo, and 3% DMAE gel over 16 weeks. And we see This is placebo or vehicle. This is DMAE. And the scale is from 0, meaning looking fabulous, no aging at all, to 9, very severe aging. So these people at the outset were in the 3.6, 3.7 range, right? So this is not that bad, I assume. The age of these people was between 35 and 60. After 16 weeks, the DMAE gel group improved by about 10%, a bit less than 10%, from 3.6 to 3.4, and the placebo group improved ever so slightly. And the results in the dermatologist evaluation was significant at one time point at the end, one time point only, although there was a progression to improvement at this point. But for the first 2 months, really, you couldn't draw any conclusions on the improvement. But at the end, you had a very modest improvement in the subjective overall appearance as judged by clinicians. And so that was one outcome. And then the other outcome is they measured a bunch of parameters. This was a beauty study. If you've listened to the evaluation framework discussion of studies, this was not a real clinical trial. They did not set their endpoints in advance. They measured a bunch of endpoints and looked, here's a bunch: forehead lines, coarse wrinkles, increased lip shape. And on some of them, at some points, they attain significance and at others don't. And for some reason, they're measuring the effect at 18 weeks. They show 2 endpoints that actually were statistically significant at 18 weeks. And only one of these was actually statistically significant at 16 weeks. So this is how they can say, based on increased lip thickness, which did not regress in 2 weeks, that the results were maintained. But you'll see at 16 weeks, which if this was a real study, you set a specific time point for evaluation, and let's call it 16 weeks, they only got statistical significance on one factor: increased lip thickness. And so you saw some improvements in forehead lines at week 6 and week 12, but for some reason not at week 16, right? So improved neck firmness, almost statistically significant at week 4, but nowhere else. This is the Johnson & Johnson subjective data. So the endpoints in the study were entirely subjective, except for 2. They evaluated skin tone with the device, and they evaluated skin moisture content with the device. There was no effect of the DMAE on skin color or tone. They don't report any effect. They do say, it's highlighted here, instrumental evaluation of skin moisturization was found to be better with active DMAE application than with vehicle at various time points and relative to baseline values. So, increasing moisture content, right? And we know that can affect subjective evaluation and some of the other subjective measures that they were looking at. So you can't separate the subjective improvements from the improvements in skin moisture content. That's an important point, and one we will return to. The other thing is there is a large incidence of adverse events in both groups, 40% in the DMAE group, 47% in the placebo group. And, we're told that there are no statistical differences, but we don't know whether the adverse events in the DMAE group were different than the adverse events in the placebo group. We just don't know. We don't have any information about that. So that is the Johnson & Johnson study. So now we're going to go back to the Brazil group study. Now remember, they had a hairless mouse in vivo study as part of this peer-reviewed publication, and they also included some human clinical data. And they evaluated 2 objective measurements. They evaluated water content in the skin after application of DMAE or vehicle, and they evaluated skin function, skin structure. So let's start with the water content. They showed that both the vehicle and the DMAE formulations could increase water content in the skin in the forearm. They measured in the forearm and the eye. They didn't see any increase of either formulation on the eye area, but in the forearm, they could increase the water content with both formulations. And then they also measured skin structure using a cutometer. A cutometer pulls the skin and measures how quickly it bounces back. And so these are considered the mechanical properties of the skin, and there are various parameters. How quickly does it pull? How far does it pull back? How quickly does it snap back? Does it snap all the way back? And these are designated different elements, UA, UF, UR, UE. But in this case, there was no effect of the formulation, either after a single application or after 8 weeks of use. No effect on skin mechanical properties. No effect at all. All right? So that's the Brazil study. Increased water content, both DMAE and vehicle, no effect on skin mechanical properties. So this is the last of the 3 clinical studies, and it's the first time we're showing this paper. It's called Split Face Study on the Cutaneous Tensile Effect of 2-dimethylaminoethanol gel. And it's the senior author is Gerald Pirard from Belgium. He runs a very well-esteemed dermatopathology group in Belgium, and this was funded by Johnson & Johnson. So this is a good publication, Skin Research and Technology, from a preeminent group. So the study's definitely worthy of our attention. And it describes 2 clinical studies. And they're not quite real clinical studies because I doubt that the protocols were published and I doubt that they set a primary endpoint, but because this is a really top flight academic group, they're very well done. So they did 2 studies. Study 1, where they measured tensile strength in response to a cutometer, which is a similar device used by the Brazil group that pulls on the skin and measures how quickly it snaps back. This was only 8 subjects in that study. They didn't get any effect. So they decided to run a second study. This study, they used a more precise device, a device that's very seldomly used in studies. So a device is put into the skin, releases a wave, and we see how quickly that wave passes through the skin. And they measured 3 parameters: the maximum wavelength speed, the minimum wavelength speed, and the average. And they didn't get a statistically significant effect on the average speed. They were close, but they missed it. They only had an effect on the maximum speed and no effect on the minimum speed. Now remember, this is interesting. They changed 3 things from the first study to the second study. 1 is they changed the device. We already discussed it. 2, they changed the study population. They went from a broad study population to a younger study population, and they also stipulated that the study population could not be overweight. So all of the BMIs of the study population were below 25. So not necessarily representative of the general population. And then the other change that they made was, instead of measuring after 10 minutes after application of the cream, they measured after 45 minutes. So these were really interesting changes in study design. And what they found was, even after making all these changes, they found a very modest change, a less than 4% change in the multi-directional speed at which sound waves travel in the skin. So the structure, the function of the skin really did not improve significantly. So that's pretty interesting, right? So we have 3 studies. Johnson & Johnson studies, we have the Brazil group, their clinical study, and we have the Belgian group with Johnson & Johnson, their 2 clinical studies. Now let's return to our protagonists, our 3 YouTube protagonists, and their cases that they're trying to make. Unfortunately for Dr. Perricone, the human clinical data is really quite disproving of his hypothesis. So there's no effect on objective measurements of skin structure or function, tensile strength, mechanical ability. We don't see it. So now let's discuss Mad About Skin. Do we have any evidence from the 3 studies to support his assertion for either a anti-inflammatory effect or a collagen-inducing effect? And we have none. So there's no effect on skin tone measured objectively in the Johnson & Johnson study. No effect on skin tone. No effect on pigmentation. No effect. And when we look at the skin function measurements in the Brazil group study, no effect. In the Belgian study, no effect either. So if we were seeing an induction in collagen, we would have maybe seen something in the Brazil group study because they looked at subjects for 8 weeks. 8 weeks, we have no effect. Now, in the Belgian study, they only looked at immediate effects. So here, we wouldn't have expected to see the effect of collagen induction because that doesn't happen within 45 minutes. But unfortunately, in the human clinical studies, the only consistent effects were on lip thickness and shape. Also, for the Johnson & Johnson study, we have an alternative explanation to collagen, and that's we had a singular improvement in water content with the active formulation relative to the vehicle. So that seems to be more of the explanation than any potential induction of collagen. Now, what about No BS Skin? She actually got very sneaky support by the Johnson & Johnson study. And it's sneaky because we saw a 40% adverse event rate in the active group, 47% in the placebo, but we don't really know what those adverse events were. And so perhaps you have the same type of swelling occurring in the active group. And we did see an increase in water content, which is consistent with swelling. So of all the arguments, I would say No BS Beauty was the best supported, even though none of those studies were looking at swelling or adverse event rates as part of their outcomes. But it's sort of a hidden support. We see in the Johnson & Johnson study a unilateral induction in water content consistent with swelling, and we see a relatively high adverse event rate. And so both of those are consistent, or let's say it this way, both of those are not inconsistent. Both of those are not inconsistent with irritation being the mechanism of action and why you see some improvement in the overall appearance, some modest improvement in the overall appearance. So before we draw conclusions, we have the most important part in my mind, or the most interesting part, which is element 4, sourcing, data sourcing. So remember, when we talk about sourcing, we talk about what makes good sources. And one element that makes good sources is to have objective data. The other element is to have data from well-respected academic groups that are independent. Now, we have two pieces of in vivo data from independent groups. One shows some sort of effect in the dermis of hairless mice, which may not be applicable to humans. So we can take that with a grain of salt. And then we also have swelling of the rabbit ear from the Canadian group. It's consistent with swelling of cells in vitro. And so I think that with the in vivo data, the strongest quality data points to no BS beauty. Well, what about the clinical? What's the strongest quality? What's the best quality clinical data we have? Well, let's start with the weakest quality clinical data we have. The weakest quality clinical data we have is the Johnson & Johnson study. It wasn't even published in a peer-reviewed journal. We don't really know how it was done. They didn't select an endpoint. They select a scattering of endpoints. It's a classic beauty study. So what strong clinical data do we have? So we have data from the Brazilian group, unaffiliated. They used a standard measurement of skin mechanical properties, the cutometer. They enrolled a relatively large group of subjects, and they saw no effect. Not one element of the cutometer readings was improved by DMAE. Now we also have pretty strong evidence from the Belgian group. Now they're biased towards Johnson & Johnson, and you can read from the way they've worded their paper, they tried to minimize the damage to Johnson & Johnson. But at the same time, they did a high-quality study. They tried to bias the results towards Johnson & Johnson. They picked a more accurate tool to measure mechanical properties. They abandoned the cutometer because they didn't think that it was going to find anything. They went to a more specific device. And still, if they were to pick a primary endpoint, they would say that they failed on their primary endpoint. So the clinical data, again, is pretty strong. It argues against Dr. Perricone and against Mad About Beauty. The preclinical data, the in vivo data, and the reporting of adverse events and water content increases is objective, and it argues for no BS beauty. So if I were to draw my conclusion, I would say it's likely the DMAE is acting by nonspecific irritation of the skin. This is causing some plumpness, particularly in the lips, but it's not improving skin structure and function. And so my recommendation would be to avoid formulations with DMAE and pick something that works with your skin rather than something that provokes your skin into an unnatural reaction. Now that irritation that we're seeing reported by the Canadian group, that could also explain the increases in collagen formation found by the Brazilian group, because we know that from the Retin-A studies. So if your skin is irritated, it will adapt to that irritation, and it will adapt to that irritation by restructuring itself and by making collagen. So, I can't say more without really understanding the type of collagen changes they saw. but I would guess that it's not inconsistent with the response of the skin to irritation. So I hope that was useful. I know we went through a lot of data, but that's what it takes. That's what it takes to really evaluate something. And you can't do it in 8 minutes. You can't do it in 8 minutes. You have to go and you have to be systematic. And I hope that you enjoy this content. I know some of you were doubting the importance of the framework. I'm hoping that now you feel better about having watched that 53-minute video. And I hope that some of you who didn't watch the 53-minute video would go and at least go to some of the chapters and watch some of the chapters on clinical studies and data sourcing, which I think we saw play a really pivotal role in an evaluation. Thank you so much. You guys are great. I love your support, and we're starting to change skincare. So thank you. Thank you very much.